Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 29 cheat sheet. 2 game weeks off from the blanket week, and then also very close towards a wildcard window for lots of managers in 32. But I think some people are open to the idea that you can wildcard a bit later. I've started to see a little bit more discussion about that, and I think it makes sense, especially with some of the larger news that we have in terms of, let's say, maybe Haaland being out, and the uncertainty around that. And what that means for your team going forwards, if you're going to move your team away from some of the City picks into, let's say, more of a sort of Liverpool-centric team, more money potentially even being put on Salah. We'll talk about Salah in a moment. I'm sure people will have opinions on it. But just the idea that for City specifically, 31 is a blank, 32 is not a great fixture, 33 is not a great fixture either. So is there an opportunity, if you're going for a slightly different strategy compared to other people, to maybe skirt the wildcard 32? I myself don't really like a late wild card, so I think I'm quite set on that strategy. But I think it's helpful for some managers who are making moves to keep an open mind to potential alternating chip strategies, because that can put you in a very differential position versus a lot of other managers, just in terms of the teams that you're able to put out around those chip windows, not specifically just on the chip window. But regardless, let's just jump into the cheat sheet. If you've never seen the series before, it's effectively an FPL tier list, position-wise, price-wise as well. So effectively, I would say the efficiency of a certain player depending on their price point. Now, the strange thing with the FPL sort of dynamic at this moment in time is, I think with Haaland being out and a lot of people still lacking a lot of faith in Salah, which I understand, you don't really need money. And it almost feels like we're heading towards this wildcard window where you don't want these Arsenal players because they're likely to blank and maybe you've already sold them. You don't want to buy more City players because you're trying to manage the blank and therefore you're not buying more. And so there's not much money to spend in this game. And even someone like Florian Wirtz is out. So yeah, very tricky window. And I think there's a lot of value in a lot of the cheap forwards, a lot of the cheap midfielders. Maybe the forward position is actually where you spend a little bit more money, even if Haaland's out the picture. But I think in the midfield, it's very hard to say and to justify, outside of maybe an Mbemo or a Semenyo, that on a per game basis, or a Bruno, of course, that any of the players really need a lot of your money and your attention. But that's such as the game that we play, and things can switch very, very quickly in terms of the value of money when we wildcard in Gaming 32, or when you do a little bit of a later wildcard as well. So to jump into things, I think in that sort of 4.5 to 5 million tier, Douglas Luiz gets a drop for me. We saw in a very early substitution. Aston Villa as a whole just don't look particularly good. You're already starting to see Unai Emery trying to kind of tinker with the team, finding alternative solutions to things. And I think that a 60-minute substitution is basically the end for Douglas Luiz, right? Because that's going to impact his almost Seabird type numbers. Stack is still very, very good. His numbers are still very positive, and his minutes, I think, still look like he's the type of player who's going to continue to start games. And the free kicks, the set pieces are still there. So he's still a very good pick. And to be honest, I maybe would even say that he's worthy of being green, but there's always circumstances where, because the Leeds have so much depth in the midfield, you've seen, I guess, their comfort in not playing Stack in certain circumstances. So I do find that a tricky balance. Whereas in the sort of 5 million plus tier, you're seeing Dewsbury Hall, players like Garner. These players are just very, very solid for multiple other reasons. I think their minutes are even more guaranteed. So I think that threshold of playing, let's say 85 to 95 minutes, that is quite meaningful for a DEFCON type player, especially for these players who very often straddle between the threshold of, let's say, maybe a 10 or 11 DEFCON and need that extra 5 to 10 minutes to get to 12 in more circumstances. So Dewsbury Hall, he definitely benefits from that a little bit as well. Garner specifically, Garner actually has out DEFCONed Anderson if you look at the second half of the season, but I don't think that that's a good sample, right? At the end of the day, Anderson has had multiple managers. He did fail to hit DEFCON in his previous match, but I think that was also kind of expected. And I don't see much changing with him as a pick going forwards. It's nice to see that his minutes, have not continued to be on the low side, if you want to kind of point reference to some of the earlier substitutions that we've seen as of late. As far as the Tavernier, I've made him a rise, and I've still put an asterisk around him. So I've spoken about Tavernier. I put him as a differential last week, and I said, I think with him, it's very likely he's going to have one start, maybe one non-start, because I think it's quite hard to believe that a player coming back from a hamstring injury is going to be able to start 2 games in a row. Now, I could be completely wrong. You might think that because Tavernier is such an important player for Bournemouth, that he's just going to start 2 games in a row because Bournemouth need points as well, and he's kind of critical towards that. Plus, they're a little bit thin. Like, for example, if Evan Nilsson's not going to play, Groupie Jr. might have to play a little bit more advanced. They don't really have anyone in the 10, and maybe Adley's a little bit out of favor. So that's kind of what I find a little bit tricky at this moment in time with Tavernier, where I think he is an amazing pick, and specifically for game weeks 30 and 31, if you're looking for a transfer, he might be one of the best midfielders to just buy outright, like not even looking at price. But I do personally have a belief in this, and I do think that Tavernier is most likely going to get benched just for fitness reasons, and I'm happy to be wrong. So it's a tricky situation for a lot of managers because you have to make that call of, do I start a player like this or do I not? And I think it's a tough call, but otherwise he's just an amazing pick. Anderson, just purely on DEFCON, same with Garner, they're fantastic, both on some set pieces. Garner, as you can see, this season has had a little bit more XAG per 90, so there's an argument to be made that Garner is actually a better pick than Anderson. I'm not sure if I'm quite willing to get there, but there clearly was a transformation in terms of Garner and how essential I feel like he's become to this Everton team. Really around that AFCON window when players like Gueye left the team and we start to see just absolutely crazy output for Garner, even when Dewsbury Hall was out of the picture. And he seems to have been able to actually maintain these DEFCON thresholds and is now competing very closely with someone like Anderson. Now, I've added Alex Scott into the cheat sheet as well. He's a bit of a jack of all trades. You can see that the NPXG numbers are actually very positive for a player like this, right? Because you're starting to, I think in terms of how you profile him, I mean, he's more of a center mid for this Bournemouth team, but the DEFCON numbers are very, very good. And okay, maybe he doesn't have that sort of set piece value that some of the other players have, but I think he's starting to come into his own here as a very solid pick. And specifically from the minutes perspective for Bournemouth, I mean, he's held together some really, really good minutes as of late. And I think, I probably, as I said last week in the video, jumped the gun a little bit with Adley. He clearly was, in my opinion, much lower in the pecking order than Ryan, thinking about Tavernier coming back, which I should have, but that was sort of rectified last week. And so in this context, I think it's still fair, though, to put Scott where he is. In the next tier, I still have Ryan top. I still have Dango top. Yes, Dango was subbed off a little bit earlier versus Burnley. I think part of this is when you look at Brentford's fixture schedule, they have 3 important games in a row, including an FA Cup game that's quite tough compared to some of the other Premier League teams that have, generally speaking, easier FA Cup games. And so with the game state, I suppose, which is not positive, right? This was a game state where Brentford had a massive lead, then suddenly we're 3-3, completely neck and neck, and then Dango and Shade both get hooked. Part of that, I think, is Damsgaard was playing well, so that kind of, allows for Brentford to occupy one more attacking position through him, whereas Dango in recent matches has played more minutes. I don't really see him necessarily as someone who's going to be on the bench, but I think there's a small chance of that because you're starting to see that Frank, what I think is interesting about Thomas Frank as a manager, sorry, why am I talking about Thomas Frank? Keith Andrews, Chief Keith. So with Chief Keith, I don't even know why I'm doing this, but okay, with Keith Andrews anyways, the point I think is this season is he's got his 6-year extension with the contract, but the key thing with him really is that he's very happy to make changes with his team and to use the full strength of his squad. And so despite maybe, let's say, people may be making the argument a couple of weeks ago that Collins was going to insert himself back into the lineup because he's the captain of the team, or that players like Dango have such good underlying stats that he's going to continue playing minutes, there is still a small sliver of a chance that he could get hurt. I still think because the Brentford fixtures are so good and because Dango's underlying is so good that you can be shielded a little bit from the minutes impacts there. With Ryan, we're starting to still continue to see 90-minute starts for him, and it almost feels like he has locked down that right wing position. So I don't think my thoughts have really changed on him. Was it a great performance at all versus Sunderland? Not really, but this is kind of what we were talking about last week, where as much as I rated Ryan, I think we have a little bit more comfort in the sample size of a Dango or even a Wilson, arguably, this season. Moving on, Casemiro, I still think is a solid pick. You can see the NPXG is very valid. United just have really good routines, and they've scored a lot of set-piece goals. Casemiro had another chance in the previous match. The DEFCON numbers are solid as well, and his minutes have held up because effectively Ugarte can't be trusted to play minutes. Somerville is sort of in an era where I think because his NPXG baselines have actually continuously risen, I don't feel comfortable sort of continuing to nerf him or to drop him in tiers, even when the West Ham fixtures are quite tough. I still think he's actually quite a solid pick because he's kind of stepped up as a player. And so have West Ham entirely as a team. When you look at their underlyings in recent matches, they've been performing at a very high level. Even the Liverpool result, when you look at just the underlyings basis, I think is a very positive result compared to, let's say, if you looked at, let's say, the market expectation of goals, right, in terms of the EGs versus what actually came up as a result for West Ham. Their attack was still, I think, overperforming the market expectation. So it just shows you that this West Ham team, in my opinion at least, have kind of hit a new level. Whether they can maintain it is a separate question, but I do think Somerville is a pretty big part of that sort of improvement. In the next tier, Harry Wilson obviously has an asterisk, but it seems like I saw FPL Harry actually tweet about it, but maybe on Instagram he's already mentioned that they'll go again. Sure, you can argue the other way around that we go again on Wednesday doesn't mean anything. It could just mean that he's just celebrating a team win, and once again, sort of hopefully trying to celebrate another team win on Wednesday. But I think that's positive news for a player. Like I've previously talked about how whenever I see a football player sort of mention things like, I'll come back soon, that's actually a pretty good indication of they might not be back for 2 to 3 games in a row. Whereas if a player is saying that, I feel like that's a little bit more positive, and maybe indicative that he could come back for Wednesday. Regardless, I think Wilson is just a very easy hold. He's one of the best picks in the game. I don't think there's much to be said about that. We have discussed positive finishing on the cheat sheet multiple times, and he is a career-long positive finisher, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So I'm happy I brought Wilson in. Probably won't be so happy if he's not available for Wednesday, but you just need to stay tuned towards the news. We will get an update from Marco Silva most likely, but I think it's so far positive news on Harry Wilson. And I think the key thing with him too is that he's an exceptional candidate for a captaincy in Gameweek 31. With Njai, people have asked the question of, why does he still belong green? Yes, the underlyings recently have been poor, but I still think, as I've been saying to other people, it's not too dissimilar to, for example, owning a Sobo, right? The underlyings are not amazing for Sobo, but you still see that he can get points through DEFCONs, which Njai got in the previous match. And yes, I think when people compare Njai to a Dewsbury Hall or a Garner, I completely understand the sentiment that you can probably just make the counter argument, which is Dewsbury Hall also gets DEFCON. Garner also gets DEFCON. So why go Njai? And I think part of it is still, when you look at it, the XAG in open play is not too far behind what is, I guess, the average between Garner and Dewsbury Hall. And then on top of that, he still takes penalties, right? There's an inherent value to that. He has, for example, gotten a goal recently just from scoring a penalty, not really doing anything in open play. Plus, I think when you play Burnley, you really should be able to thrive as an attacker in open play in those circumstances. And I would think that that's actually a very, very good game for him. Whereas when we talk about a little bit more of the sort of DEFCON only type players or more of the set piece type players, I don't think that's necessarily correlated as perfectly towards when they play versus a really poor opponent, unless that opponent is also really, really poor in set piece defending. Because it's more I think sort of the NPXG when you look at opponents, or NPXGC when you look at opponents, is more indicative generally of the open play value, because that's still the majority of how chances are built. Now, of course, 20 to 30% of some teams' chances this season have all come from set pieces, but you get the point and the gist that I'm trying to make. As far as Njai, I think he will clearly rapidly fall off, right? He'll go straight to being an orange, and some of the other picks in Garner and Dewsbury Hall probably will drop towards the yellow next week because they're a little bit more future-proofed with the DEFCON piece and also the set piece. But yeah, I do think Njai definitely does drop after Burnley at home. So part of the reason why he's still here is Burnley at home. Sobo I still think is fantastic just because he is an all-rounder. There's nothing too spectacular about him, but he does guarantee you minutes. He does guarantee you potential DEFCON. And the set piece value is still there very much for him, whether it's direct free kicks, whether it's set piece assists. What we have actually added, I think he's a differential in the sense that if you want to sort of mention that he's taken his level up a little bit, and I think you can probably argue in that sort of more center mid type role within the team that he's currently operating that there's maybe more chances for DEFCON, more chances, like for example in the Tottenham game, to actually find himself in situations where he becomes a bit more of a bonus racker, plus the XAG pieces there. Then I think there's a bit of scope to say Iwobi is actually a pretty interesting pick to look at for certain managers. Do I think it really makes sense with his sort of price point? No, which is why he's just an orange pick. With Sar, I actually think with the, and this is the first time I'm talking about this, but Tottenham actually looked like such a poor team. And part of the reason why I actually put Wilson into my team as opposed to a Dango is because I was generally convinced that I think this Tottenham team looked no better than a Burnley team right now on defense. I think it's calamitous. The manager is not really saying anything positive about the team, which is to me also not positive. I'm sure the mood around the team is very low, but that's a team that you target. And ultimately, for example, from a SAR perspective, if you somehow held him to this game week, I think just hold him again. Tottenham seems like a great fixture now for any team that wants to get attacking returns against. And I think that's even been proven by. For example, look at Arsenal and Gyökeres and Eze doing so well within that Tottenham game, and then sort of going back to normalcy right after. Maybe this is, too harsh a criticism, but I think that's how we should be evaluating Tottenham right now. And I think when you look at Liverpool, part of the reason for why we have one of the big changes in the cheat sheet is because Tottenham at home just looks like so much better of a fixture in Game Week 30, to the point where I would say that a Liverpool player once again looks like one of the best captaincy options in Game Week 30, and maybe might not have looked like that a couple of weeks ago when you had more enticing looking fixtures like West Ham, who have clearly improved as a team, or even arguably, let's say, Bruno versus Aston Villa, where fair enough, you can make the same argument with Aston Villa. They have not been great as of late. But regardless, we move on towards the next tier in the 7 million tier. Gakpo, I've actually added to the cheat sheet. I think with Wirtz, I'm still a little bit shaky. Plus, they have Champions League. They have lots of fixtures to play. With Wirtz having a back injury, my concern always is what's the load that this player is allowed to manage. And the more load that, let's say, Wirtz has to manage, then I think the better it is for Gakpo. Now, you could use the same argument to actually say McAllister deserves to be on the cheat sheet. And I think someone actually commented in my transfer plans video, why don't you think about McAllister? And I think to an extent, McAllister's role, I think, is quite conditional on Wirtz, whereas Gakpo could still start Premier League games without, Wirtz being with Wirtz being around. Whereas with McAllister, I think his value as a player does tend to drop if he's not going to play, maybe that could change if, let's say, it could be the exact opposite of what I'm saying. So Wirtz could actually play left wing. McAllister can still be Mac 10 for all intents and purposes, and I could be wrong. So, but I do still think that in most situations, in most circumstances, Gakpo is going to be a pretty solid pick because there's not really anyone challenging his minutes. Even though Rio has been exceptional, I think in some of his sub appearances as of late, I think his minutes are still decent, and Liverpool's fixtures are still good enough where it almost feels like Gakpo still would get those guarantees. Now, Rodgers, I'm going to give a drop. It does feel a bit harsh, but I think that there does seem to be a bit of a shift in once again, the team underlines for Aston Villa. They're not in the best state at the moment. And the criticism for someone like Rodgers has always been sort of the underlying stats, respective to, what other peers are doing in that sort of price point, even if you were to sort of take into account that he is a positive finisher. So I think the criticism here is lack of set pieces. Ultimately, a team that just doesn't look like that they're improving. I think part of the case for why I put Rodgers here was that when they had green fixtures, it almost seemed like that was scope for him to actually improve his underlines to do better than he has done in the season. I don't think that really has been done. So that's why Rodgers, to me, gets a drop. With Rice, he gets a drop with the uncertainty, plus the blank Game Week 31 coming around. I think that could be, not ideal for someone like Rice. And I still think probably if you look at the next two fixtures, maybe the value is still going to come from the defenders. I could be wrong because I've been wrong about Rice many, many times this season. I don't see him as a problem hold, and I think you can kind of view him similar to that sort of Bournemouth situation where I think the positive with someone like Rice is if he's fit and he's available, he will start games. It will not be the case where he's coming off the bench. That only happened, I think, once early into the season, and that was actually when Rice wasn't playing particularly well. So when I actually listened to some interviews from Rice about his season so far, I mean, he kind of pointed out at the start of the season, Arteta actually kind of outlined a couple of things that he wasn't happy with at the start of the season, and that kind of has been the impetus, I think, for Rice to have the brilliant season that he's had so far. So I think those days are pretty comfortably over. Now, in the next tier, I think it's a lot of availability kind of issues. Now, I have Cunha as an orange pick, and I feel like maybe this is wrong. I mean, he's continued to kind of rack up very, very good minutes, and maybe I think, to be fair to Cunha, he probably could be a yellow. I just find it hard to say that if I was to kind of tier the players now, especially with Sesko being firmly in order, that if, let's say, someone was having a bad performance between Ahmad, Cunha, or Sesko, that any of those players would kind of close themselves off from being able to be subbed off. Now, Cunha has put in some good performances. I think a lot of people point out to effectively what I would say is close to a man of the match performance in the previous match before Crystal Palace, but I still think Mbeumo has a lot of staying power in his role. He has that sort of element of being able to play multiple roles as well within the team, including center forward share. And I think, generally speaking, when you look at underlyings, there's a basis to say that Mbeumo is much better than Cunha, especially when I think from a fixture point of view, these are not amazing United fixtures, right? So you really need Cunha to be like an extremely sort of productive player to say that's the justification to own Cunha versus some of the other picks. Whereas if with Mbeumo with slightly better underlyings, I think there's less of a case to need to make that. So Semenyo's a fantastic pick. I think he possibly could have pen share whilst Haaland is out. Now, keep in mind with Haaland, we'll talk about Marmoush in a moment, but within, Semenyo, I think one of the pieces here is that he just has great minutes for this team. I think he's had great minutes for Bournemouth, even when he's had to manage midweek games. I still feel like Pep feels the same about him. Something we talked about with Doku this season is that even when Doku has to manage multiple games and he's first choice, he still gets subbed off early. Whereas with Semenyo, that just generally hasn't happened. Turkey, that does happen too, whereas Semenyo is impervious to that. So I think with really good fixtures on the horizon, potential penalty share, potential even benefits from the positional share piece if Haaland's out, I think Semenyo is just a wonderful pick. And fair play once again to anyone who's continued to own him. With Wirtz, we know he's out for Game Week 29. Game Week 30 actually looks like an amazing fixture. I would probably question whether he's going to have perfect minutes there because Champions League is going to be important for Liverpool as well. You could probably dismiss the sort of quality of Galatasaray as an opponent, but I still think that that's relevant, right? Because if you want Wirtz back for the Champions League, I'm not so sure if the Premier League minutes are perfect. So that's why I think I almost think he could even be an orange tier pick and he could be a sell this week if you have some intuition about whether his minutes could be poor for Game Week 30. Because Game Week 31 is not particularly good for Liverpool. Then probably the most controversial segment in the video. Every time this season, I feel like when I move premiums around, people will sort of raise suspicion. I remember last year when I dropped Salah, even with his record-breaking season, at some point to yellow, and a lot of people were sort of questioning it. He then ended the season with a pretty poor run of games, but I think a lot of us just were kind of held captive by just how good the season was. Now, this is the complete opposite. This is Salah having an absolutely abysmal season, but I think this is very similar to the Palmer situation. Now you're looking at the meta, and it is almost potentially Haaland being out. It is a situation where that Tottenham at home game looks infinitely better than it did a couple of weeks ago. Not that Tottenham were good many weeks ago, but now it looks like the defense has basically been, blown open, or it is ready to be blown open every week. And then Wolves probably a little bit better, but you want a captaincy option for Game Week 29, and that probably strengthens the prospect of Salah. Now, I think it's very similar to that Palmer situation. The benefit that Salah has had this season, despite his open play value completely dropping off a cliff, is that he can still take set pieces. So he can get corner assists like he did, for example, versus Sunderland, and he can also get these free kick goals, which we've even seen him score one in the Champions League. He's also taking some indirect set pieces as well in terms of just general sort of indirect free kicks, where it's not like Sobo takes all of them. Salah actually has a positional share on that as well. Now, the open play piece, I think you can criticize Salah as much as you want, but the open play value is here, right? This is 0.28 NPXG per 90 and 0.22 XAG per 90. Now, that's very, very poor for Salah and very, very poor in general for a player that's 14 million. But in a game that doesn't have Haaland, I think that still is reasonably good value when you factor in penalties. So I don't think this is very dissimilar to when I brought Palmer in a couple of weeks ago, and I think the logic was there just because of the quality of the opponents that they're facing. Now, in theory, that should also mean potentially higher chances for penalties. We've seen Wolves give away a lot of penalties this season. I don't think that that's too dissimilar. So I would probably have a look at that as well in terms of Salah actually being a very reasonable pick for the next few weeks if you have 2 free transfers, 3 free transfers to accommodate for a Salah switch at this moment in time as you head towards a wild card. Now, for people who might not be wild carding, maybe there's less of an argument. But I think actually when you look at Salah's fixtures, the case is pretty fair. I think the only anti-case against Salah is really the minutes, because you can look at the market expectations, and I can tell you season long that they've dropped, right? As soon as we think Salah is worse, I think the market also continues to believe in that as the performances continue to drop. Now, the substitution versus Nottingham Forest was not great, but I still think that there's a lot of scope here to say that Salah is still a very reasonable pick. It is a punt against the field. He still has value, and he's on penalties. So make of that what you will. I think he's actually a very solid pick in the specific context that we have, right? If Haaland is out. So that's my 2 cents on Salah and why he's a green. And yeah, that's the game we play. In the forward position, there's a lot of changes here. And I think a lot of changes because of Haaland as well, right? Once Haaland is out of the picture, if he's out of the picture, and I'm not sure if he is, that's why I've given him a soft drop. I think there's an element to if he generally has an injury, maybe that has reduced minutes impacts over the period of games where he also has to manage Champions League as well. And then on top of that, you probably have some fears about, re-injury, the recent sort of minutes substitutions as well. Like, for example, 45 minutes getting hooked off versus Fulham because he had a knock there. So I think there are threats on that, and that has probably and will probably also push people to make further transfers this week to kind of shore up the type of team that they have for Game Week 31, right? So if Haaland's out of the picture, it actually kind of allows you to maybe even consider selling him, right? Because the price drops are going to come, and just move into players like a Calvert-Lewin or a Thiago or an Ekitike. I think those are the three best forwards in the game, because if you're playing fixtures, that's how I would do it. Not too far behind those, a lot of the other 7 million forwards. But if we're starting from the top, Krupi Jr., in my opinion, still gets a drop. I know Evan Nilsson has not trained so far, so it might mean that his minutes are really good. But I think Enes Unal is still a squad depth piece, and I think it's very likely that you could still see Enes Unal play. I think Irola is a sensible manager, but it's not like he feels like he needs to play Krupi Jr. 81, 90 minutes every single match. So I think there's scope for him to get benched going forwards, and I don't think the Evan Nilsson sort of dead leg is going to be that impactful for the game week 30 and 31 minutes. Like, that can still hurt Krupi Jr. in a way. Calvert-Lewin, though, doesn't really get hurt by that. He's on penalties. He's got great minutes. And I think really, really good fixtures here from game 29 to 31. I'm quite shocked that he actually dropped recently, but I also get that. This is a player who recently has gone through a sporadic sort of run of blanks, but is still getting chances. And so, to me, there's the basis to own Calvert-Lewin. Barry's minutes are not perfect, so that's why I've given him a very soft drop. I know this is Burnley at home. Obviously, if you own Barry, you're going to keep him, but you get the point. With Raul, I think with Muniz continuing to take more minutes, and of course, this fixture being a midweek game, there's an opportunity, I think, for Muniz to come in actually and start the game. So that's my take, and that's why Raul gets a drop. Evan Nilsson is already at a bottom tier, so is Strand Larson, who just still simply doesn't have, I think, the quality of underlying stats or numbers that I think are good enough really for a player who might not even be on penalties. As far as the next tier, Sesko's a new option. I do think it's very likely he can continue to carry on with his run of starts. Part of this is sort of just backed on by his run of form. I think the punt for Sesko is not that risky in the context that I don't think Carrick is that temperamental as a manager. It took him a while to sort of put Sesko in the team, and now that he has, I also feel like it almost will take a while for him to take Sesko out of the team. For Bowen, I think he deserves still a rise. I was a bit harsh, I think, dropping him last week. I think in recent memory, the defensive contribution numbers have ticked up a lot. Part of this is just the change in the role under Nuno. So when you kind of compare the Potter numbers to the Nuno numbers, there's a market difference. Plus, of course, a market difference when other players came into the team, right? So when Tati Castellanos came into the team, etc. So that's had an impact on Bowen. The set piece aspect is there as well. I want to acknowledge that actually some of the value towards Bowen is going to be that set piece. And he's a very different forward compared to a lot of the players here who are more goal oriented, where at this case he's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of goals and assists because of the role that he plays, and then also he does defensively contribute. No one else in this sort of even position comes close. João Pedro, I think, still gets a soft drop. This is fixture related. I still think that, Chelsea is probably going to struggle over this run. I don't see him necessarily as better than Calvert-Lewin. I'll say that there. So if you're looking for a buy this week, I don't think there's a massive gap between Bowen, João Pedro, and Calvert-Lewin. But if I had to pick one, it would be Calvert-Lewin. And that's kind of just to reorientate the cheat sheet in that way. And Ekitike, similarly, with Tottenham looking better, with his performances continuing to be very good, and, uncertainty on Haaland, I mean, he's going to rise as well towards being a green option. And Haaland, of course, will just be subject to whatever information we get from Pep, likely none. In the defensive tiers now, I don't think there's actually a lot of movements in defense, right? Because defense is a bit more of a stable position. It's a position that moves less because DEFCON does kind of like average out a lot of the results. And of course, we've mentioned multiple times this season, but the quality of the mid-table team is so high, and there's not too many sort of relegation photo teams really that you need to even own from when there are so many cheap picks across the board. So Goodmunson, in my opinion, gets a rise in that sort of cheap tier. I think Leeds actually have looked like a really, really solid team on defense. He's still at a very excellent price point for people who just want a cost saving, and maybe I think is even worth, chancing versus Hill. Now, of course, Hill has a lot of value from the DEFCON, but just something to mention. Alderete actually went back to his best recently with finally a great DEFCON performance to remember. So he's back in the swing of things in terms of DEFCON. But I think the key thing is that Sunderland's fixtures are still very, very tough, which is why they're in the yellow tier. With Strauch, I mean, he's a bit of a DEFCONer, and I think Leeds are, a similar-ish sort of quality of defense towards the Sunderland. I don't think there's a massive gap. When you look at fixture runs to end the season, Leeds have a much cleaner fixture run than Sunderland. So I would actually expect that some of the XGC numbers here to be changing and to maybe move more positively towards the Leeds direction, a little bit more negatively towards the Sunderland type direction. Rodon, I think, gets a drop because I think he might have a knock. I'm not sure about it. We'll find out. But once again, he's not as good a DEFCONer as some of the other picks here. and also doesn't have the same sort of NPHI as, let's say, a Gudmundsson or even a Bogle, if you wanted to compare other Leeds players within the team. And yeah, I do think Struijk is markedly better than him as well, even from a goal threat point of view. Now, in the next tier, I've given Cash a drop. I just think that it's kind of hard to justify with Aston Villa sort of looking like a team that is slipping in terms of the team strength aspect of things, especially on defense, how we can kind of continue to keep Cash at the top tier. Some of the fixtures here are still very, very good, but I think the concern is when you look at some of the fixtures now, Chelsea United aren't particularly good. West Ham at home looks great, but they're also a team, as we've spoken about, who have definitely looked like they're on the up. So that's kind of my issue there. None of the other changes have really been made. I still think Ayer and Vandenberg will start all the games. Maguire and Dalot should start if Maguire is actually fit. He always seems to have a knock every single match, so we'll monitor that situation. Anderson was only ill, but there is an asterisk around Anderson. Just need to monitor the news about his illness. I think it was quite an emergency sort of integration of Issa Diop into the squad, so it might be the case that Anderson was at the peak of his illness, and for that reason he didn't play. But I think with him coming back soon, those are still really good fixtures for Fulham, and I think I wouldn't be too worried about him. Senesi is still an absolute beast in DEFCON, kind of finally righted things wrong versus Hill in the last few weeks by outscoring Hill massively on DEFCON. So that's a positive for him. In the other tiers, I still feel O'Reilly's one of the top options. I mean, you look at him every game now, he just looks like an absolutely crazy threat. Could have scored in the previous match as well. I feel so awful actually not owning him compared to, let's say, Virgil van Dijk, who I don't feel too bad about, like not owning. O'Reilly does scare me every single week. Konate, I still think is a very solid pick. Actually, close with DEFCON in terms of the value with Virgil now. I think it's now slipped almost the other way, but it's still very, very close between the two. Mateus Nunes, I still think is a solid pick, but of course, Blank Gaming 31 could come around, right? And something I want to mention in terms of Blank Gaming 31 is that fixture might not fully be crystallized, but I think it's still quite likely that City beat Newcastle. So all the kind of inferences in terms of Man City and the value around Blank Gaming 31 is on the assumption that Blank Gaming 31 is going to crystallize, but it's very hard for people to justify making moves in the proactive direction of saying Man City is going to lose to Newcastle in the FA Cup and that Blank Gaming 31 is not going to happen for them. So just a bit of common sense there. In the next tier, I've given Munoz a drop. This is just Crystal Palace sort of related. I think they actually put in a very good performance versus Man United, if I'm being completely honest. I think it's just a bit of a negative that Lacroix won't feature for the Tottenham game. Leeds at home, I still think, is a really reasonably tough game. And then, of course, Blank Gaming 31 versus City is a thing. Keep in mind, of course, that I'm showing the fixture here, but it's very likely still going to be a blank. And of course, the cheat sheet is aware of that, and the cheat sheet maker as well. Tarkowski has a great fixture here, but he'll probably drop after this. He's actually been not amazing in DEFCON because I think when we looked at the start of the season, Tarkowski was in a tier of his own. Now, a tier of his own sort of next to, I think, maybe close to someone like Murillo. And it's funny to see how things have sort of changed so massively this season, where you now have a lot of other competing options doing much better or having much better numbers that would be a lot more valid or valuable. So yeah, Tarkowski has dropped, but this is Burnley at home. Nothing we can do to change that. Virgil is still an excellent option. He is him. And Gabriel, Saliba, Timber. Nice to see Saliba and Timber score goals. I don't think we were really ever questioning the value of Saliba and Timber, and I think I've spoken multiple times in the cheat sheet where you can still see them as very easy holds in your team. But equally, I can see why people have moved away from them just to maybe, I don't know, capitalize on Blank Gaming 31 with maybe Virgil, and that's fine. But yeah, Timber still has a lot of value. So does even arguably Saliba to a lesser extent, because I still think he's not as much of a goal threat as Timber. But that's it for the cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let's just quickly look into the goalkeepers as well before I end things. Dubravka gets a drop, Martinez gets a drop, and Pope gets added as an option. I don't think there's much to be said about goalkeepers here. We have some uncertainty from what I could see on Twitter in terms of the recaps of Arteta's press conference comments. I think he should be fine in terms of Raya, but of course, Blank Gaming 31 is what hurts him. Same goes for Donnarumma, prospectively, and even a Henderson. Pope has been added to the cheat sheet because I think he's actually a reasonably solid pick, especially with some of the games coming up, like, for example, Sunderland at home and Gaming 31. Like, for example, if you're shopping for a Blank Gaming 31 keeper, he might actually be the one to go for. Otherwise, Dubravka gets a drop. I think still the numbers are very, very negative for this Burnley team. And yeah, I still think they're massively far apart from a team like Leeds in terms of quality defense. And it's ironic because you can actually see, for example, Jose Sa as a good comparison for this, because the only pro towards owning Dubravka is the save piece of things. Whereas when you look at the XGC piece, like teams like Leeds and Wolves, who are 16th and 18th respectively on the sort of ranking, are still miles away from a team like Burnley in terms of the defensive numbers. So that's kind of my take on that. And that's pretty much it for the cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Goodbye and enjoy the midweek football.